Martha lived on the edge of the dusty plains, where the wind carried both the scent of wild sage and the echo of old sorrow. She had once been the wife of a rancher who was known for his steady hands and quiet laughter, but after the accident that took him from her, the laughter in her home faded into silence. The house stood lonely against the endless sky, and every day she rose before dawn to light the stove and face the same endless rhythm of chores. The neighbors would nod politely when they passed, but behind their half-smiles there were whispers that floated like dust in the air. They said no one marries a fat widow, and that was the phrase that kept circling in her mind until it became part of her breath. She was not young anymore, and years of work had shaped her body into something strong but round. She carried water and chopped wood, and tended to the animals the same way she once tended to her husband, and though her back ached and her hands were rough, she never complained. She wore her grief like an old shawl, one that kept her warm but heavy. She had tried to sell milk and butter in town to make ends meet, yet even when people bought from her, she could feel their eyes sliding over her body as if to measure her worth. She had learned to keep her eyes low and her voice even never showing the flicker of hurt that stirred inside each morning as she walked to the barn. She would remember how her husband used to greet her with a smile and a cup of coffee, and how he would tell her she was beautiful back then. She had believed him, but now the mirror only reminded her of what she had lost. Her face had softened, her waist had widened, and her heart had folded in on itself. She told herself that love was for the young and slender, for women who wore ribbons in their hair and danced at town socials, not for widows who smelled of hay and soap and worked until their fingers cracked. The town itself was small and harsh, much like the land around her were. Men who worked the cattle and women who raised children, and all of them seemed to move through the days as if nothing ever changed. The gossip about her was not cruel, but it was constant, and that made it worse. She would hear her name followed by a pause, then a soft sigh or a shake of the head. She pretended not to notice, but the words lodged in her like tiny thorns. She began to believe that she was not meant for companionship or kindness, that her only purpose was to endure one afternoon. As she carried a bucket of water from the well, she stopped to catch her breath and looked out across the open fields. The sun burned low on the horizon, painting everything gold. And for a moment she felt something small stir within her. It was not hope exactly, but a kind of quiet stubbornness, a whisper that maybe there was still more to her story than work and whispers. Yet before she could let that thought settle, she heard the clatter of hooves on the distant road and saw a lone rider approaching. Slowly she set down the bucket, brushed her hands on her apron, and stood straight. Her heart did not race, but it did not stay still either, because even in her weary solitude she knew that change had a way of arriving when the world least expected it. The rider came just as the evening light began to fade, and the first chill of night settled over the land. He moved with the slow confidence of a man who had traveled far, but without hurry. His horse was lean and dusty, its mane tangled from the wind, yet it carried itself with pride. Martha watched as he drew closer, the rhythm of hooves steady against the hard ground. She had not seen many strangers pass her way, and fewer still who turned in at her gate. When he finally stopped before her fence, he tipped his hat and greeted her with a quiet voice that sounded like gravel softened by kindness. He said his name was Luke, and that he was looking for work and maybe a place to rest a while. His clothes were worn. His boots cracked from the trail, and his eyes held the weary patience of someone used to long roads. Martha studied him for a moment, unsure whether to invite him to stay or send him along. She had learned that solitude was safer than trust, yet something in his manner felt different. There was no pity in his gaze, only a calm respect that made her uneasy in a way she had not felt for years. She nodded toward the barn and told him he could stable his horse there, and if he wanted supper, there was stew on the stove. Inside the small kitchen, the air smelled of onions and smoke. Luke sat quietly at the table, his hat resting on his knee. He did not speak much, but his silence was not heavy like most men's. It was the kind that left room for. Breathing, Martha ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one before him. Her hands shook slightly from habit, not fear, and he thanked her with a soft word and a nod. They ate in the kind of silence that feels almost comfortable, and when he finally spoke, it was to ask about the ranch, about her cows, about the work that needed doing. She told him plainly there was plenty of work and little pay, and he said that was fine by him. Over the next days, he stayed and worked repairing the fence that had been broken since last spring, mending the roof and helping her carry feed to the barn. He moved with an ease that made the hardest job seem small, and though he never asked questions, he listened when she spoke. She found herself talking more than she had in years about her husband, about the land, about how the winters came hard and the loneliness came harder. Luke never offered sympathy, only quiet understanding, and somehow that made it easier to breathe. The townsfolk began to notice. The stranger staying at the widow's place, and the whispers started again. But Martha no longer flinched at them. Luke's presence filled the silence around her with something steady and warm. One evening after a long day's work, they sat by the porch as the sun bled into the horizon. The air was still and golden, and she realized how long it had been since she had felt peace. He said the land suited her strength, and that not many could do what she did. She looked at him, then truly looked, and for a fleeting moment, she felt seen not as a widow, not as a woman judged by size or circumstance, but as herself. When the night grew colder, Luke rose and tipped his hat before heading to the barn to sleep. Martha watched him go, her heart steady, but unsure she had not asked him to stay, nor had he promised to. But something unspoken passed between them in that quiet twilight, something that felt like the beginning of a change neither of them yet understood. The days stretched into weeks, and Luke's presence became as natural as the sunrise. Each morning, Martha would find him already at work, fixing tools or tending to the animals. He never asked for pay, only for food and a place to rest. She had tried once to insist on giving him money, but he shook his head and said the work was worth more than the coin. She did not argue again, though she wondered why a man like him, with a strong back and steady hands, had no place to call his own. The town kept talking, of course. Rumors drifted through the dry air like dust. Some said she had taken him in out of loneliness. Others said he was using her. But Martha paid no mind. The truth was simpler and far quieter. She had grown used to his footsteps, the sound of his voice in the evenings, and the way he never seemed bothered by her silences. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always with a gentle honesty that felt heavier than the gossip she had known all her life. One evening, the air was thick, with the scent of rain, and Martha was mending a torn sleeve by the fire. Luke came in from the barn, his shoulders wet from the drizzle. He set his hat on the table and sat across from her. The flames cast long shadows on his face, and for a long, while neither of them spoke, she could hear the wind pressing against the windows and the steady beat of her own heart. She did not know why, but the quiet between them began to feel too full, too close, and words rose in her throat before she could. "Stop them," she said softly, almost to herself, that people still talked about her, about how no one would marry a fat widow like her. She kept her eyes on her sewing needle, and her hands did not stop moving, but her voice trembled. She said she knew what she looked like, that she was not the kind of woman men chose, that her body was more burden than beauty, but she could still work. She could still keep a home. She could still care for someone, if only someone saw her as worth caring for. The words spilled out like a confession, and when she finally looked up, Luke was watching her, not with surprise or pity, but with a quiet patience that made her chest ache. She felt foolish for speaking so plainly, and tried to laugh it off, saying that she did not mean to sound so hopeless, but the sound of her laughter broke halfway and turned into something close to a sob. She looked away, embarrassed, and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Luke did not move for a long time. He sat there, as if weighing her words against something deep inside himself. The fire cracked softly, and the rain began to fall harder against the roof. Martha wished she could take back what she had said, but it was too late. The truth was out hanging between them like a storm waiting to break. She had spent so many years holding her silence that the release left her trembling. She told herself that he would leave soon, now that he had seen the smallness of her hope and the heaviness of her heart. But when she dared to glance at him again, he was still there, steady as ever, his eyes calm, his hands resting on the table. He said nothing yet. Somehow his silence felt like the beginning of an answer, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself wait to hear what might come next. The fire had burned low, and the wind outside carried the sound of rain across the open fields. Luke sat still for a moment, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked at Martha with the same steady, calm he always carried, but his voice when it came was softer than she had ever heard. He said that the folks who talked about her did not understand what strength looked like. He said they were blind to the kind of beauty that kept a home standing, and a heart beating when life tried to break it. He told her that any man who thought a woman was less because she was built for work instead of dancing did not deserve her company. Martha did not speak. She only stared at him, the firelight painting, his face in golden shadow. He went on saying that in all his years riding from town to town, he had met many people, but few with the grit she had. He said she worked harder than most men he had known, and that she carried her sorrow with a kind of grace that humbled him. He said that if the world had more women like her, it would be a better place. She wanted to believe him. But the years of quiet shame clung to her like a second skin, and her voice came out small when she asked why he would say such things to her. Luke smiled, not wide but warm, and said, because they were true. He said he had watched her keep her land alive when any other soul might have given up. He said he had seen the way she treated every creature under her care, with patience, even when she was tired or hurting. He said that kind of heart was rare, and that a man would be lucky to share his life with a woman like her. Martha felt her throat tighten, and for a moment she could not breathe. She had been called many things over the years, but never strong, never graceful, never worthy of love. The rain outside softened into a hush, and the room felt smaller somehow, as if the air itself was listening. Luke stood then and moved toward the fire. He stirred the coals with the poker, then turned back to her and said he did not know what tomorrow would bring, but if she would have him, he would like to stay not as a worker but as a partner, someone who could build something new alongside her. The word struck her harder than any she had heard in her life. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she was not sure, that she was afraid, that she had forgotten how to be anything other than alone. But the words caught in her throat, and all she could do was nod. For the first time in many years, she felt warmth that did not come from the fire. It spread through her slowly like sunrise over cold ground. Luke's voice broke through her thoughts once more as he said that the world might never stop talking. But that did not matter, because the world had always been loud and wrong. Martha laughed then softly through tears that surprised her. The sound was shaky at first, but it grew lighter until it filled the small room. Luke smiled at the sound and reached out his hand, not to pull her close or make a promise, but simply to offer comfort. She took it, her fingers rough against his calloused palm, and in that quiet touch, she felt the weight of her loneliness ease. The night outside was still dark and uncertain, but for the first time it did not feel endless. She had lived too long listening to the cruel rhythm of other people's words, and now, for once, she let herself listen to her own heart and to the steady voice of the man who had changed. Everything with a few honest sentences. Morning came with the smell of wet earth and the low hum of waking birds. The storm had passed and the sky stretched wide and pale above the hills. Martha stepped outside the small house, her boots sinking softly into the damp soil. The air was cool and clean, and she breathed it in as if it were something new. Luke was already in the yard tending to the horse, his movements steady and quiet. She watched him for a moment without speaking, and for the first time in years, she did not feel the familiar ache of being seen. She felt only calm. The days that followed carried a different kind of rhythm. They worked side by side, fixing the barn fence, hauling water, clearing brush. Luke never treated her like someone to be pitied, and she never felt the need to hide her strength anymore. When the townsfolk came by, they looked at her differently, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet respect. No one spoke the old phrase about the fat widow now, and even if they had, Martha knew it would no longer wound her. She had heard something truer from the only voice that mattered. As the months passed, the ranch began to change. It no longer felt like a place of ghosts, but like a living thing full of sound and purpose. Martha started keeping chickens again and planting herbs behind the house. Travelers sometimes stopped for food or rest, and she welcomed them without the guarded stiffness she once had. Luke built a bench under the old oak near the well, where they would sit together in the evenings, watching the sky fade into violet and gold. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was warm, easy, like the quiet of two people who did not need to fill every space with words. Sometimes she still thought of her husband and the life she had before, but the memories no longer brought the sting of sorrow. They rested inside her like gentle reminders of who she had been and how far she had come. Luke never tried to replace that past, and she never asked him to. He became part of her present, in a way that felt simple and true. When he smiled at her, it was not out of pity or surprise, but out of steady affection, and she learned to meet that smile with one of her own. One evening near the end of summer, they sat by the porch, watching the fireflies drift through the dusk. The air smelled of grass and wood smoke, and the soft creak of the rocking chair filled the quiet. Luke looked out across the fields and said that the land had a way of healing those who stayed long enough to listen. Martha nodded and said, "Maybe people did too." He turned to her then, and the light caught the kindness in his eyes. She felt the old doubt flicker inside her for a moment, but it faded just as quickly. The night deepened around them, the stars gathering. Above, like scattered lanterns, Martha leaned back and felt the peace of the land settle through her bones. She had spent so long believing her story had ended with loss that she had forgotten how quietly a new chapter could begin. She looked at Luke and realized that change did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came softly on horseback, with kind eyes and patient hands and a voice that saw worth where others saw none. In that quiet under the vast open sky, Martha understood that. She was no longer just the fat widow at the edge of town. She was a woman who had worked the soil, rebuilt her heart, and found someone who saw her strength for what it truly was. And as the night wrapped gently around them, she smiled not for the town or for what was lost, but for the life she had built from everything she once thought she had broken.